Everyone has laptops, right?
And other devices.
Well, because we are the mailmen of the district. Either rain or sleet or.
I was like, where's that going? I was trying to follow that.
Okay, well, sorry.
But we can work from home, so that's what I'm saying. We have the ability to. And, yeah, that's another issue.
Still got a minute there. Is the RSVP to talk to the boardroom meeting? There's a conflict.
It's 5:30 p.m. on 15th of January 2020. This is a work session on calling to order.
This time, all Chief Accountability Officer to give some additional information and provide us updates regarding high-quality policy at work. And before we get started, we will provide just some context that, as we know, each and every school board director's role and responsibility is threefold. It's to hire and evaluate superintendents, to approve budget, and certainly to review and policy. Policy governance is critically important work. It is, as WASDA described, the crow's nest where the school board directors are giving the charge about what is to be done, where are we going as an organization, where should we, making sure we keep our eyes prized, that we're not running into glaciers, challenges there. So we work closely with superintendent and staff, we're guiding the ship through the waters, sometimes smooth, sometimes challenging, and staff is working in concert to make sure that the organization runs smoothly and effectively. Today's that policy work. So we can have another view of what these are.
So, good evening, President Hamada, Board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Holly. I'll pass this around to you all. There's a whole packet, so take it by the paperclip and we'll go through piece by piece.
Okay.
And I'll go this way. We also each have a copy. Thank you, the opportunity. It's very few, I would say, enjoy doing policy work, but it's important to our organization. This is just to kind of recap where we've been as a district. So some of this may be familiar to you anecdotally because you have watched this happen. Some it may be a little more familiar. Director Vengadaslam, Director Daniels actually lived this, but it just kind of recaps where we were in 1819. And so high-level pieces of this, big things to remember or to know, is that we currently have approximately 10 policies that were in flux, meaning that they've gone through a first reading but haven't had a completed formal action by the board. We're going to circle back around to what that means and possibly a suggestion for that, but just know that part of our work last year, 18 policies were reviewed and updated, and then there were 10 that were in the process of update as we went into transition and closed the year. We had quite a bit of meaty policy discussion, and as a history in Kent, we've had quite a bit of policy work to do. Because policy is a living, breathing, continual cycle. So on top of the being behind in our updates, they are also updated as laws change, as sometimes possibly lawsuits happen and the law is tested. It requires updates. And WASDA does a really nice job of monthly putting out policy updates of things that have changed per RCW or WAG. And I can make sure that you all have access to see some samples of that. There can be 10 to 15 pages in length sometimes when they put those out, so I didn't want to print copies of those on top of that, but I'll make sure you get access so you can see what one of those policy updates looks like. And that's how we know as a district when policies are updated in between. And so since then, we've contracted with, as a district, with WASDA to do updates to kind of get us up and kind of en masse move us forward. And so in your packet, you actually have a copy of the contract signed if you want to see that. So that's next, that's your next stapled pieces. It's a copy of the contract. And then after that, you have an example of what that work looks like, and we'll talk through that as well. And so what the WASDA contracted policy update does is they go through all of our policies, every single one, and they do the RCW and WAC update to make sure that they are still current and all of those pieces. And then they do the updating of the language as it relates to an interpretation of the law. So that's what they do. What WASDA does not do is get into the district philosophies or other language of that. And so a lot of times that is where, to be fair, that's where the hard work is. And that's where a lot of times boards will get caught in the wordsmithing of that piece, and that's what takes some time, is ensuring that those district philosophies show up there. And so,
Could you give me an example of that? If I can visualize it.
So here's a great example. The fund balance policy per WASDA is actually what they consider an essential policy, meaning that they recommend that every district have it. But their model, so their template for what they think that language should look like, basically says that something to the extent that a district should have a fund balance to preserve the expenditures when money is not available in the amount of blank. And they don't make a recommendation on what the amount is. Now, what that amount is really a philosophical debate amongst the district. And we were engaged in that as a district, and yes, our policy says 5%, but what does 5% represent? Meaning, and some of you may remember, we had a very robust discussion about what it takes to operate the school district for a day. And then how many days did we want to exist if we didn't have new revenue coming in? And then using that to determine what the fund balance should be. But WASDA didn't necessarily say it should be 5, it should be 10, it should be 2, or it should be this dollar amount. The statement just says they should have one. And then they left the hard work of the philosophy up to the board and the district. So that's an example of kind of where that space lives. Sometimes it's very cut and dry because there's a law that says we have to do something. And then there's policy that says that exists that way. There's, I don't remember the exact one, but there was a very specific nuance. I think it had to do with the board's ability to hire family members or something, and it got very, very specific. In districts under a certain size who also did this were allowed to hire that staff. And the question, I think, of one of the board members at the time was, why is that possible? Or who made that decision? And it was actually in the RCW, that level of specificity. And so we're like, yeah, even though it's not relevant to us, technically, we probably should leave it because it's law. So WASDA does a really good job of helping us on that piece of it. So that's what WASDA has done. That's what their updates look like. That's what they've been contracted to do, is to provide that connection and link. So to that end, they were contracted to start that work. What they are doing is handling that series by series. So you all as board directors have received your binders of board policy, and they are separated by series. There are 6. There's some districts, there are some 0 series ones that deal with district operations, but right now we have 6. And what they suggest is that boards who are going through this process, and they do this quite often, believe it or not, with several districts. So we are not the only district who hires out to WASDA to do this massive update. That boards start with the 1,000 series. Not because they take them in order 1 through 6, but because the 1,000 series is typically the smallest, least contentious, kind of simplest to go through. And what they've said when I've talked to them about that was it's because it allows the board to develop their own cadence and protocols for how to process through and kind of churn through the policies and those updates. And then once they've established that kind of norm amongst themselves, it becomes easier when we get into some of those heavier, deeper, and kind of longer policy sections. So think about that in terms of like the 5,000 series as it relates to staff, or even the 3,000 series as it relates to instruction, 2,000 series as it relates to students. All of those things tend to be a little bit heavier. So that's why, although there's not a particular rhyme or reason of where the board has to start, that's just typically what they recommended. The next series that they've suggested we move into is the 4,000 series for a similar reason. So it's kind of like the board is getting their feet under them, understanding their own cadence, and getting really kind of revved up for the more complex, the harder to go as we go along. So what we have received back are the 1,000 series updated by WASDA. What they also do not do in their update is they don't do any district formatting. So it sounds small, but if we use a particular font and a particular size and all of that fun thing that gives it kind of a KSD branding, that has to be done on the updates. So we get them back, and that happens. We also at that time give them to the community or operational people and staff of the district to review to make sure that we're not missing any kind of procedural or process steps that we do. And what's typically happened is that then they come to the board for review. And in the past, the board is usually given 2 weeks to review and consume, because usually we have quite a few on the slate, 10 or so at a time. If you're talking about engaging in a full series the way WASDA has suggested, it probably, I would recommend taking a month to look at them. And here's the why of that. It's, even with the 1,000 series, there's about 18 to 20 of them. And given that this is you all's kind of first time together doing that, you probably want to have a good understanding. And so when we get back to that, I'm sorry, the next is the contract. And then there is the Board of Directors 1,000 series. What WASDA does is they give a nice overview of all of the policies that have been updated. And they give great recommendations. So WASDA categorizes policies 3 ways. So they have what they say are essential policies, and essential policies, it's defined here so you don't have to take notes. They're not mine, it's right. There's a section that says definition of policy or categorizations. So they're not my words, they're WASDA's, and you don't have to rewrite it. It talks about policies that are required, and so that's what an essential policy is. It usually, they're sometimes rare, but sometimes happens that a state or federal law says that a policy has to exist for this thing. Or that it's tied to funding. So typically those are the essential policies. There are a few across the board, and you see those categorizations. There are others that are encouraged. And that means that it's in the best interest of the district to usually have some operational guidance around what is expected and has to happen. And then there are those that are discretionary. And the discretionary are really then based less on law. So there are some RCW and WAC associated with them, but they're more about district belief systems. So for example, our race and equity policy would be what WASDA considers discretionary, because there's not necessarily any law governing it. It's a district belief. And because of that, we've decided to memorialize that in policy, and that's perfectly appropriate. So as we've done this type of work in the past, we've focused on updating essential first, and then moving into encouraged and discretionary was the strategy initially. If we move into the WASDA kind of suggested way of doing this by series, one way to kind of break this down into smaller manageable chunks might be to, even within a series, focus on the essential, the encouraged, and then the discretionary might be another way to kind of break that down again. I will say that most of the work will always be in the encouraged, because there are not many that are required by law, and we have some that are discretionary, but there are not tons that are discretionary either. Most are encouraged. So that's how that happens. And so in this, they give that great reminder of the definitions. And then they talk about the types of policies that were reviewed, and then the update. So they give a brief summary of what was done, its categorization. And then a summary. And then they make a suggestion of policies that they have in their roster that we don't necessarily have on our books. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to implement those. They're just giving us that as kind of their due diligence of here's everything that we have in our 1,000 series. And here's some to consider. And they've also provided those as well for us. So in the update, they've also provided the recommended.
Are they
units.
mixed in here or at the end?
So at the top here, just as new policies to consider, and they
Oh, okay.
and they have not described them, but they did send a updated, meaning they've written out that language for us and developed that for us. So we do have them if we choose to, and you would have access to them to read.
Okay.
It looks like our procedures, right? The new policies that they have.
Yes, and also, the procedures are also there. So they've also accompanied procedure with that as well. And then last but not least, you have an example of what that looks like. So the last kind of stapled three pieces together are an example of what you could see and what's typical of looking at policy. What you see here are kind of the three iterations of this. We've tended to operate in an electronic realm, but if this is what it would look like if we operated on paper. So you have the current version, which is what's active on our website on Board Docs.
Mm-hmm.
The next version is, and you see it in bold, it says WSSDA WASDA update.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what WASDA returns to us with track changes. So they've gone through, and they don't delete anything. They either add language, they strike through language that needs to be removed, so we can see all of the iterative changes. And then the third document you have is then what the policy would look like if we adopted and made every change that WASDA suggested. Not saying that you have to as a board, but it just shows you the version of what it would look like and how it would read if we struck through the language they said strike through and added the language that they said add. I intentionally picked short samples of this. As you know, some of our policy can be very lengthy. That's why I said we may need a strategy for how to kind of break this down into smaller, manageable chunks. Because when you start to get into policy, sometimes it is 2 and 3 pages long already, and then you add in the track changes. And that's why sometimes for me, having these separate versions allows me to go back and forth in a different way to be able to say, okay, how did it read before? And now how does it read after? And still be able to see kind of the in-between. So that's the brief history of policy in Kent School District.
Seems like, Dr. Harmon, we should focus on the essentials first, and then just gonna have you circle those. And there seems to be 6 of those.
And so that is very helpful, because what I always love leaving hearing is what is the board's interest, next steps of where do we go next. I do think for me logistically with operations, it would be helpful to know the order that you'd like to hear them, and I hear that now.
Just a suggestion.
I hear a suggestion on the table, but it would also be helpful to know for me the format in which you'd like to receive this. So right now, WASDA is operating with us in an electronic format. Because like I said, it can get pretty long, and we're talking about different versions of this. And so in the past, we've used, we've emailed them. In the past, we have set up a OneDrive so you can have access to all the iterations and versions when you're ready. Welcome to even work through, at your own availability, working through kind of a separate learning session if you want to walk through some of that in an electronic way of training and how to access those pieces if that's how you'd like to receive them. I prefer, when working with a group, and we've got to be careful of how we do this, using track changes, because then you can capture your kind of notes in the moment of what that language would read and look like before you come to the meeting to share. We have to be careful how we manage that, because we don't want to create a situation where it's an open public meeting, because technically you are all editing a document at the same time. So we just need to be mindful of how we create that space without violating that because but I think we can manage you all having electronic access without having shared electronic access, if that makes sense, meaning that you all are not all in the same document at the same time.
So-
You have your access.
So if we each add our own
Yep.
OneNote, and then we send it to you with our suggested changes, and then you would compile all.
the changes that are suggested, and then we could talk about the changes that are suggested, with everyone having their versioning of that, and the why they want that or why that's important.
Well, then you can have that discussion.
Right, yeah, and that
Right,
discussion
yeah.
could happen that way without, right, and that keeps us from violating, but allows it to happen in real time, which is a lot easier than trying to keep track of lots of pieces of paper for the record.
Right.
Sometimes becomes very difficult. And I don't want ideas to get lost. It also will allow us to kind of keep up a cadence that will continue to make progress, because the discussion of the changes in the policy are just step one. The board actually has to take action on that and approve that policy in order for it to become active. Otherwise, the version of record, which is the current version, remains in place until an action is taken. And I'm sorry, Director Daniels.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, I just wanted to clarify that we don't update procedures.
Right.
So some of these listed are procedures.
Right.
So we don't do
Right.
work with those.
And so it
As
typically,
per policy. As per policy.
so what typically happens with a procedure is once the board updates the policy, now, staff continues to monitor board's progress with policy. But once the policy is finalized, then the staff update procedure to reflect the rules, the new governing of the policy. And then that is shared with the board during informational. So that would show up on the informational section of a board regular meeting. So you would be made aware as a board member that a procedural change has been made. Typically, it's because something has happened with policy or law that changes how we do business. So although the board doesn't take any formal action on procedure development, you are informed and aware of what those procedural changes are as it relates to the policies you all have adopted. Does that make sense? That's not too
It
circular.
makes sense, it's just,
Do we all have access to WASTA, the website? I think we do.
So I believe you all do. I believe you do. And that is a plus. So whatever you see shared in these updates should actually reflect. So WASDA actually has a section called Docs Online that has the policies as well there. And so whatever you see in these updates should match what's there. It was our reference historically whenever we would update policies, we would refer to that and then make the changes based on what showed up on the online version.
Right, because some of them are discretionary.
Right.
Some are district
Right.
specific, so you
Right.
might not find out.
Right, not all of them, because if we've made them up ourselves, then WASDA
Right.
will not have a recommendation.
I have now, Dr. Harmon, have now formulated an intelligent question. The procedure that is done by the staff, is it reflective of the policy that was changed? Is that taken into consideration? Is that how that's done?
So
Yeah.
Okay.
absolutely. So that
I
is
understand that piece of it.
that is key to this. So our job as staff is to figure out a way for the district to live with the rule that the board has set out. So how do we then operationalize this? So for example, if the board were to say that we were going to do a policy around commitments to equity in terms of training or some formalizing of something like that, it would be discretionary, but that's something we could do, then we would have to come up with some procedural way to ensure that, how is that happening? So the board through policy says that every staff member has to be trained. We have to come up with some procedural way to ensure that that happens. And so that's where we start to develop a process of that. Sometimes that happens with committees. So there are policies where the board says there must be a committee to do such or to discuss such. And then there's procedure to talk about who those members are, how often they may meet, or how those members are decided, those kinds of things.
What happens if you, I'm not saying this is probably traditional, what happens if you just disagree with the procedure?
So our board provides feedback on our procedures.
That's happened.
They've provided feedback on our procedures. And
I'm asking, I'm trying to learn.
No, and I said our board has provided feedback on the procedures. I've had experience with our board providing feedback on procedures that we've developed. And so I'm looking because I'm pointing at the podium, not necessarily at you, Director Daniels. But our board has provided feedback, and so what we do, and they've asked questions about why this and not this way, and we discuss that. We talk about either the why we've done it this way or why not that way, and they've made suggestions. And although they are not necessarily the deciding authority in that, we do listen to, we take into consideration ways that we can honor the interest of our board. Not just because they're the board, but typically because the why behind it is usually something that's in the best interest of Kent School District. And a lot of times when we cannot, we talk about either what's prohibitive in the way we operate as a district that prevents that or some other system in place. But we do talk about that, and a great example was we were trying to be more fiscally responsible, and we were revising our travel procedures. Previously, we followed per diem by the federal government was our standard, but we were cutting the checks for those expenditures so that people had the money before the trip happened or as they were getting ready to leave for the trip. In order to have a better financial hold on what we were doing in our expenditures, we reversed that to say that they would get reimbursed after they returned. And at the time, the discussion was, well, what about staff members who can't necessarily afford to pay that up front? What do we do? Valid concern, and we figured out a way to not make that the rule, so we didn't go back to cutting a check for everyone beforehand, but a way where employees who needed to have that so that they could travel, they were able to have that without a lot of kind of hoop jumping and discussion. So we were able to compromise.
And just for my clarification, when you read it from the dais as a procedure, all of what you've done, is that after all, if there was any conversation, you wanted to change it or add something or add something, that dialogue all takes place before it's formally read?
So, no, what typically happens is policy gets adopted and you all make a formal change to policy. We then work on the procedure and then we present the procedure at the next or a board meeting or two later. And then it's included on the agenda in the same way you have access to the agenda before a board meeting. And so typically those questions are asked from the dais by a board member, and we have that discussion in an open public meeting. And it's okay. We talk about the whys, like I said, in public, and recognizing too that they show up under informational, and it doesn't mean that, because what we will typically say is we will bring back to you the changes based on this or that if we hear.
Thank you.
So.
And I will say that in the past, we didn't always have the procedures attached with the policies, and so we weren't able to compare notes, and so that's a welcome change that's happened this past year.
And I haven't, you're gonna have to bear with me, because I'm just learning here, and I'm just stupid enough to come out here and just ask all my questions. I'm not embarrassed by being dumb.
Not at all. You're not at all. This is the time and place for that. This is.
On the electronic, when we're on our own systems, adding, if we have something we want to write, is it all going to be, you'll see that, and so I could see others, or?
So no, so you would not be able to see others while you're making your changes, because that's where the OPMA, the public meeting violation, comes in. But you would be able to see, so in this example, what you would be able to see would be two things. You could see where WASDA made their changes to our original.
Right.
You would see sometimes Pam's name where she's made some formatting changes to make it look like our policies. And then you would see your changes there. And that is helpful for me, because when I get it back, what I'm going to pay attention to are the director comments and changes, not necessarily Pam or WASDA's, because they would show up elsewhere. And then
And then at that point, we come back to a work session and discuss.
where we see, right, each director's in one document the changes. That's how that would happen. But it allows us to save versions. It also allows you to see what your changes look like. And that's why I said we can work on this whenever your schedules have availability of how to really maximize and optimize the track changes feature in Word, because it allows you to kind of toggle back and forth between a finished version and a version where you see all your markups. Because it gets very difficult after a while when you've made lots of change to read what it would look like in its final version without kind of turning that off. And so there's a way that you could turn that off without losing any of your changes to just see if it reads in the way that you intend. And so we can work through how to do that and really maximize that. No worries, it's all part of the process, but that's why I said we can work through to make sure that that happens, so, because I don't want to lose any of the suggested changes, so part of the reason why you're doing it is so we can keep the why and the what.
So on this one, when there's a cross out on the law, so WASDA must have determined that those laws don't really touch this policy?
So believe it or not, there are times when the law gets updated or changed or is no longer valid. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does occasionally. And given, sometimes that this was 2005 in this particular example is unfortunate. It's been a little while, so it's possible that the law governing this particular policy has shifted. And it doesn't mean that what was discussed in that portion went away. It may mean that it lives possibly in the substitute House Bill 2105. And so but they have done that due diligence. So they don't just strike it to strike it. They actually make sure that it's still relevant to the reason why it's there, and it's still valid.
Right. I just thought it was interesting. I was like, wait.
Until you pointed out, I was like, oh, this is a great, so real life example. This is a great real life example of occasionally RCWs or the language that was relevant to that particular to this particular policy may not be. So the RCW may still be a real thing, but it doesn't necessarily apply to this policy anymore.
Right.
It also does something else in the structure that you may not have noticed is the cross-reference section.
Right.
So it also references other policies that are related to the policy that we're currently working on, which is nice because it kind of points out a lovely domino effect. And it doesn't mean that you need to follow that path of dominoes right now, but it does let you know that if you're changing this one, you most likely will need to look into these at some future point.
Right.
Since we are going through all of ours, we don't necessarily need to follow that path in that way, but it does point to others that are related. And it's helpful for our public when we talk about why we have policy to begin with and how interested community members, staff members who want to follow the operations of the district appropriately can figure out what are those pieces that they need to follow by looking at.
So on these cross-references, I know that in the past, we have added cross-references from the district standpoint, like, for example, our multicultural work that we're doing. Some of that has been added to anti-bias and things like that. That's not something that WASDA would have, but are we going to remember to go back and update our changes?
I did not, so this one does have so I was slightly intentional in picking this, not just because of its length. If you look at in the version that has the track changes, so the second page of the policy sample, the one that has the blue kind of strike through in language, that first comment that's the WASDA staff member who made that update. And they just highlighted that this portion that they identified is district language. So they didn't strike through it, they didn't take it out, they allowed it to stay. The same thing would apply if we may have made a cross-reference to say, we don't think it is, but this is a district reference. So they do point that out, which is helpful, because it allows you as a board to say, is this still a philosophy of our district? Do we still believe these things? Do we still think it's relevant? Or should we remove this? Sometimes the law may have been updated in a way where it's now more inclusive and we don't need to call it out separately. It just depends, but they do acknowledge when something is district specific, so that's helpful. So no, we don't have to remember everything, but we. So what I've heard is that there's an interest in doing an electronic versioning of this. I've also heard that there's an interest in kind of chunking this with essential, then encouraged, and discretionary. What I've not heard is the most important piece of this for me, and it's the when and the where. And so that is kind of the rubber hitting the road in terms of our policy work, because as much as the review of this and the deep understanding can happen outside of a work session or a regular meeting, at some point, if changes are to be made, unless the board has made a collective decision to only do a first reading and take action on these as WASDA suggests in a regular board meeting. So unless you're going to forego discussion and adopt as WASDA says, then you have to discuss these in some open public meeting. And so then I would assume we would need to schedule some time to do that. And our second and fourth Wednesdays are fairly packed. I'm sure that as a board, you all have topics of interest for work session and regular board meeting presentation. And as staff, we have things that we also need to have you all be aware of in some greater detail than beyond presentation. And so I am open to, I won't even look at my colleagues to my right, and I'll just look at the board and say that I am open to non-traditional board meeting days for policy sessions. That's not uncommon in Kent School District. I think we have a limited number of work sessions, and an hour, quite honestly, is really difficult to get through any number of policies in any real way. So that has happened in the past on on first or third Wednesdays. It does not have to be a Wednesday for me. I'm flexible, so I think that's something that as a board, obviously that's up for you all to discuss, but I think that's worthy of some discussion of when we would like to schedule a next real work session.
Which would be us coming in with like, you'd be giving us packets with all the essentials or whatever.
You would have that
with all
beforehand, and you would
We
be-
would have that beforehand, but we wouldn't see everyone's suggested changes until that work session.
Or the week, you know what I mean,
Or the week
weekend before, so
before.
you have time to consume that. But yes, the whole goal of that would be to discuss the collective changes and then discuss the language to formalize that, and then determine which policies, if any, are going forward to what would be a second reading, because the first reading would be happening during that work session. Second reading and adoption at a regular board meeting, or are we carrying this into possibly a continuance and a second reading without taking an action?
So, to make sure we follow OPMA and everything, if we have a work session, do we also have to have a special meeting after to vote on the first reading?
So what we've done in the past to keep in line with OPMA is to only take action with policy at regular meetings.
Right.
So the cadence has been, the board doesn't make any action changes to policy in terms of voting to approve or approve a format. You all would discuss in detail the language that you'd want. We'd leave with those notes, and I would summarize that and then make the changes so that the next version that you see would be the pretty version ready for the world to vote on.
In the meeting.
And then you see that at the regular meeting, that's the version that would be voted. We may have a brief discussion of what was changed just so it can be on the record for the public, but it's more about, this is the version that we've agreed as a board, this is what we're voting on, this is the way it would look for the world. So you're seeing a finished version, not track changes. And then that is what is moved forward. So that's how we do that. I suppose if the board were so moved, there's nothing preventing a special meeting. We just haven't done it at that rate. We've always done it in regular meeting because it's just already scheduled, but there's nothing. Work sessions usually, the board usually gets bogged down in the work of developing the policy, making sure the language is correct, and then the action is taken since it's already scheduled rather than scheduling another. But it's not that it can't be.
Right.
What do we gain by waiting here? No, I'm not afraid, Dr.
No, I was like, we, there's nope.
What would be so horrible if we just accepted all of Boston's changes? Has any district ever done it?
So there are districts that have model policy that looks just like WASDA's. And it,
I'm not saying in favor of that.
So I'll say, so there are some WASDA policies that don't speak enough to district interests. So there are times when, at least that's what I found, so like there are policies that I review in my district because they don't speak enough to what we're doing in our district. So they send it to me or send it to whoever that department person is. I know there are some that probably do, but I think one of the benefits of the districts, they get a little more specific because WASDA doesn't know, they're doing a state policy. So what applies to Kent might not apply to the small school district. So there's language that I think has to be added or some finessing that needs to be done for the most part because we are different.
there is a one-size-fits-all approach. I'll give you an example, employee contracts. In many districts, they're giving contracts out to classified employees, and there's a reason they do that. We've not done that in Kent, and that is, so that's a WASDA policy that was provided so that every single district would be covered if you did provide classified contracts or if you did. And so that's just one example. So I would be wary of the one-size-fits-all approach.
So what I could say is that there are times, so an example of that is best, like you said, with small districts. So there are times when, per kind of the structure, I guess, of Washington State, sometimes it's OSPI driven or others, it will say that the superintendent is the person who makes this decision. And in a large district, that is, not that the superintendent isn't aware of that or responsible for it ultimately, but he is, or she, is far removed from being the person who actually does that particular job. And so that a lot of times it will be switched. It's not uncommon for us to switch that to say or designee, or to name what that role or responsibility is in this district. Is a really easy example of how it's a slight tweak on WASDA, but that's one that's fairly common.
So overall, all the time commitment that you're going to do to go through all this is very rare, right? Would you say?
It is, and it's a fine line, and of how to get into that. I would say that every board that has kind of wrestled with policy and updating has struggled with how much time to spend in communicating the district philosophy without spending so much time that they're not making progress. So keep in mind that while we are churning through these here, that every month laws are changing and WAS is putting out a monthly update of other policies. Right. And so there is a balance between like how much time is invested in ensuring that every specific deep sentiment is caught, or the policy and the general idea. So keep in mind too that that's where sometimes procedure comes in. So if policy starts to get into laying out specific detailed actions of staff, it's not that that's not of an interest to the board, but then that's really should be procedural. So if you start to get into the how, so a good general rule for the difference between policy and procedure, and when you're probably spending too much time on the wordsmithing, is when you start to get into the how. So policy is the what, procedure is the how. And typically when you start to get super deep into that, you're usually bleeding into procedure and getting into the how. And it's the what. And so I think about as board with your responsibility per WASDA, in setting that course, setting the expectations of the district. And so it's kind of goes back to, so what is the expectation regarding this? What does the law say? And is it communicated in a way where a layman could comply with that? Because if we weren't trying to communicate it in that language, then we would just rely on the RCW or the WAC. You know what I mean? So is it, so we could just, kind of regurgitate what was in the RCW or WAC if we didn't want to make it a little bit more accessible. But it's, what do you as board expect and intend? And then what does the law say?
Let me ask one more question, and I won't forget.
We are here until I believe the sign on the door says 7:30 now.
Let's just play devil's advocate and say we did accept all that. Could procedures actually iron out all the difficulties with it?
So I'm not sure.
Could you get into the personalization of the district through the procedures?
Oh, absolutely. I think
Instead of going through all the policies and crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, could you do that just by using that framework and not going through it all, and then procedures implement districts and more personalization?
So you could. I think that that's a little bit of a risky strategy for the essential policies. So for policies that are essential per the definition, meaning leading to either some state or federal or funding regulation, we may want to, as a board, you may want to spend some time having some discussion around those. That may be something that the strategy that you presented may be something that you may want to engage in a little bit more with some of the encouraged pieces. Even some of the discretionary, meaning that here's the general idea or expectation as a board that we believe in around this. And now what we'd like to see is some procedure that allows this to happen. Although all we care about as an interest of a board is that this take place. And not that broad, but I'm just, without getting too specific.
I'm just thinking, because I appreciate your conversation, because I remember hearing differently from the audience saying, you need to be updated policy, you need to be, that's the board's job, and it is the board's job. And I think understanding the daunting capacity of it is becoming more clear. But it is our job. And so I think if we come up with a reasonable expectation, because we are not going to get this done in a year. We're not, it's just not going to happen. So if we come up with a reasonable expectation of what that looks like and a reasonable cadence. I will say last year, and actually the year before that, weekly meetings I cannot do. Every week was just, that's just too much. I've got kids as well, just got other things that are happening. So I think that occasionally it's fine. I'm not a fan, I've said that before, we need every single week to do this. That extends, one would say it's like 4 to 5 hours at a time, and then the next one's up to, that just doesn't work my schedule. But that is our job. And so we've been encouraged by the public and community members that this is a charge, which we know what it is, but it is a daunting charge. So I think if we come up with something.
I have no problem with time commitment or work commitment or fulfilling what I need to do. That's not my argument. I just want to make sure that if we're going to spend all this time, it's time well spent. That's all.
I do know that I spoke to another board director at WASDA conference, and I can't remember what district they're from. She said they review and update 5 policies per board meeting, per regular board meeting. That's just part of their standard operating procedure. It's like every board meeting, it's on the agenda, they review and update 5 policies, and that works for them. We're not at that place yet, because if you look at how many policies are out of compliance or as old as 2005, I think I did the math, and we'd have to be updating 19 policies a board meeting to even, and that was starting with the December 11th board meeting, to even have everything in compliance, which is completely unrealistic. But, it's the what and the how, and we have to just dig in and start doing it.
So you were discussing earlier about how you would have the meeting and then we would vote at the board meeting. But I was just thinking, doing that would take up, the board meetings are already pretty packed as it is. What would be, I guess, the benefit or the negative to doing what she suggested and having like a special meeting just for policy? So then when we go to the next board meeting, not doing it like every single month, but just getting a bunch of them done, and then not bringing it to the next board meeting, putting everything on the agenda, just having one meeting just to approve the procedure, the policy.
So that's possible. What I did not say when we were talking about policy being on the board agenda at a regular meeting, where it typically lives, by the time it makes it to that point, it is usually on the consent agenda, and I should have clarified that. And it's usually because the board has discussed it to a point where they feel comfortable with the final version that they're seeing, and that you feel comfortable with it being a yes, no as part of the consent agenda, not having a then lengthy public discussion about more nuances of the policy. I tried to be very careful about not putting anything on the regular board meeting agenda until I was sure that the board was ready to pass what was there. And then that doesn't mean that we can't do a special meeting. It's just that leveraging the consent agenda that way is okay, because at that point you all are familiar with this thing, you are conversant in it, and you'd feel comfortable with passing it on consent agenda. I don't think we had any that had made it to consent agenda and then got pulled because the board wasn't ready. We tried to not get it there until they were ready to take action in an affirmative way. If it wasn't ready, then it didn't move forward.
Okay.
I will say I have another suggestion, and this time I won't make eye contact with anybody. I'll just look at the table. I won't say how often we could do this, but another alternative is to spend a day, possibly a non-traditional work day, engaged in this work, and considering that kind of a maximized work session. And then maybe that happens, I dare I say, like quarterly or something, semi-quarterly or something. But that allows us to, so if you think about what a day might be, that would be essentially the equivalent of 4 or 5 work sessions possibly in one day. I would say that so President Hamada knows this. I'll address her in this capacity. She knows that I can be a pretty good pusher as a facilitator in trying to get us, not for you all to take an action, but really working through the agenda of, okay, so we've promised this time. Are we really staying true to what we're doing? But that's an option as well. So if alternate or continuous weekly other meetings are not working, that's a possibility. To kind of work through some, and that might be, there's lots of creative ways to create space and time is what I'm saying, and open to that as well.
So how do we reach consensus on this?
So this is you all's work, and it's so it starts with feedback.
Do we make a motion on do this and see if it passes here? I don't know.
I think what we should do is look at our calendar. We have a calendar, look at our calendar and figure out which days would work.
But I haven't heard which option you want, right?
So you all have to, this is fair for you all to discuss amongst yourselves. There's less formality in terms of the conversation that's had during a work session amongst the board. And I'm trying to step in and out of this because it really is your decision. So I'm kind of just throwing out ideas and then stepping away from, because it really is basically you decide when, you decide when, and then we show up. Or I show up, since I kind of put it out there. I won't say we as the, but.
So Dr. Harmon said she wasn't going to look at anybody. She just I think one of the job getting to this point. Consensus now means weigh in. So our board directors, I would offer what Dr. Harmon said. What are the options that we put on the table? Review all of those options that we put on the table. Decide for at least your input on what works. I've heard all of meeting the work session on a weeknight, meeting weekly, not meeting weekly, meeting regularly as bi-monthly or monthly or quarterly. And on those days, perhaps meeting Saturday is not unprecedented, and our board retreats take place typically on Saturday, so fall, spring basis. So those are options that I can throw on the table, and we'll offer that to the board to consider.
So we could get an email from Karen or Pam, Holly, and that just says, share, tell me some dates you have available, and then she could compile it, yes. Or tell me what you prefer, and then someone could come back and say, okay, here, it seems like there's a majority that would be willing to do a Saturday, or it looks like every other Wednesday, or it looks like taking all of spring break, and no. That was a joke.
Wait a minute, I'm not opposed. That's a viable option.
I said the quarterly Saturday. That works for me. I'm good with that. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, it's like, then you just come in and it's efficient in your days, and just people work better if they're just focused on one task with regular little breaks rather than breaking up things and coming from work with, so we can
Do a series and a half. maybe.
So I would say you start slow, you build your stamina and momentum. And so I would say, as tempting as it is to be ambitious and say that we want to get through all of 1,000 and part of 4,000, I think that it would be a huge success, especially for a new board, if they were able to get through an entire series in that meeting. Because what that says is now you don't have the details of that here, but you have the basics of what that looks like, and that is, it's quite a bit. And so I think that if we were able to successfully say that we've completed the 1,000 series and we're ready to bring that to the next regular meeting, that's a huge success. Because then it says you've then also set a stamina, a cadence, you've created a norm for yourselves. We've tested whether or not our electronic use of the system actually works and we're able to do what we intend, so that we know the next time we have the next quarterly meeting, whether we can legitimately say, are we going to be able to complete the 4,000 series? Because keep in mind, the 4,000 series will have more than the 1,000 series in it. And so, you know what I mean? Are we starting to build that up?
So Dr. Herman, does this take into consideration though the fact that sometimes staff has to review? So we might have a series of policies that have to go to staff first, so we may not have all of, or does that, is
So
that not something
this is
that
taken
happens?
into consideration in that way. So while the other beauty of starting with the 1,000 series is that we don't have any say-so in that one.
Right.
That's all governance of the board.
But I'm thinking if we do that on one Saturday and part 4,000 would have some.
So it would,
So-
but 4,000 can go to staff now. So knowing that that's where we're going, 4,000 could weigh in. There are, not all of those touch every community, but we could start to say, so here's where we believe we're going. And it's likely that even if we are very successful in getting the 1,000 series done, we probably are not going to make it through more than the first 5 to 10 of the 4,000 series. I would be pleasantly surprised and super excited.
Well, even that, if we can look at.
Right, but saying that, right, to
essential-
say, and so to make sure that staff have access there to be able to provide comment and feedback is okay. And then we can start then rolling out the others when they come in from WASDA to staff. So at the same time that Pam is formatting, staff can get their feedback in on the operations side of it, because they don't have to happen separately. They can happen.
So as a staff member that reviews policy, I'm just gonna suggest that it's an addition to your job, right? So it's something that, that you find. So I understand, I just feel like it's ambitious, but.
It is, like I
very
said,
ambitious, and it's ambitious on staff. But I get it.
I think that if we,
I know. Oh.
it
It
is.
can take me 2 weeks to go through because of time, and because it can take a while. So I'm just trying to be respectful of workload and staff. Because all of these things not only impact the board, they impact all of the staff. And so I'm always considerate, being a staff member, I'm always considerate of what is the potential impact of this? Because we're in a hurry to do this, or whatever that looks like, what is a potential impact on our staff?
So to be fair, I'm more concerned about staff impact on procedure
Yeah,
than
that too.
policy.
Right, with that.
Because that's really the one where, okay, now the board has said that they expect this. And now what is the deep read and understanding of that to make sure that staff are able to comply with what the board is expecting and what the law says? And so,
Okay, before we go any further, you want to do quarterly, or do you have anything else you want to do?
No.
Director Boone. Director Van.
I just want to say, I always go by first name during the work session, so you're good calling me Maya. I agree into Wednesdays as well as quarterly, but I'm fine with quarterly.
I'm flexible. I'm right in the same boat as mine.
And I am.
Yeah, and we also, I mean, when we're looking at just, not to just, throw another wrench in the gears, but, we also haven't had a retreat just where we as a new board sit down and talk about norms and expectations and standards too. So as we're scheduling, if we could, might be a reason to just do the 1,000 series in addition to respecting staff time, to just do part, some time in the morning as we're getting started, for whatever the first retreat could be. How soon could we get the our own personal electronic version of the 1000 series?
So I think that's something that we could work on. Sorry, I'm having what day is today?
I know.
Because I was like, I paused, what day is today? So no, I was thinking about,
Since you won't look at me.
so possibly Friday.
Yeah, what's a reasonable time frame?
So I think Friday,
based
because
on your workload?
I think Friday, because the files exist. It's more about divvying it up to ensure that everyone has what they need in their versioning of that, and then making sure that we can support you, and just how to use that. But like I said, whenever you all are available, we can make ourselves available to work through kind of how to access the links, how to make sure those pieces work, how to be able to see and show what the files are.
Something that can be done like video,
Oh, so you're thinking about teaching everybody how to do that?
Is it what?
I guess the question is, does everybody know how to use the
So-
Because I don't know if that's the case.
I will not assume that, but the wonderful beauty of our board members being on board now and having district emails and district logins is that they have access to tools just like staff. So for example, Who Knew It, that serves other staff pieces, also has a component there. I will check to see what their supports for OneNote look like and whether or not that is an easily consumable example of how to process, just general how to use OneNote. And then we'll look at how we can give some one-on-one training of just how to kind of do some other pieces of that, so.
So in OneNote, you could do the track check too?
So if we were to include,
Put it on there.
I'm trying to think through the
Or
best.
could you have a shared folder with Word docs? Like, this is, each person had their own individual folder somewhere.
So that's what I was thinking too. So like we could leverage OneDrive with this in a different way, and possibly like this is your folder. It's essentially 5 operating folders of the same documents which is
Right.
created, but yours is locked and accessible
Right.
just to you,
And
so that
you.
we're not right.
Right.
Yes, but I mean, but like no other board member can see access. So
Right.
we don't violate anything. But trying to think about the right form. That's why I was like, yeah, the files exist, but what's the right
Well, they
structure?
exist in Word, right?
Right.
They
And-
exist in Word, so if they were all,
And they exist in electronic too. So they're already.
Right.
It's just trying to make sure that you all's access of format is the right place to. So yes.
So in SharePoint, you have a folder, you're
Mhm.
saying, for each
Okay, let me recap here that we are in agreement that we're going to meet quarterly. I mean, we're 3 to 2, we're 3 to 2.
yeah.
Sounds good.
But I mean, the 3 carry, the 2, right?
So we agreed to what?
Maya and Michelle said we could do either or.
Right, so what carries in the question?
I don't want it to carry, I'm just saying, we can be very flexible. I want to take into consideration your schedule too. Right, I'm just saying, how does that work?
Now, this is, we did talk
They can
about
only do that.
quarterly as well. I think we also talked about sending requests for information from my office to see what your availability was and then who is available, whether it's, because there's two items now. One is for policy review, which would be nice. The other is quarterly, full day. Helpful.
Yeah, and then it gets compiled, and then we're, like we do with other meetings, where it's just, we just send it to one place, our availability, so we don't violate any OPMA or anything.
I'm sorry, Michelle, but why can't we just decide that tonight? Why do we have to go to another computer thing to sign up? I mean, I'm sick of this.
We can.
I mean, why can't we just do this tonight?
Yeah.
And figure out a date.
Just
Mhm.
quarterly, we figure out which Saturday.
Yeah, which
Works
days.
for, I think Karen can do a doodle poll on which Saturdays that we can't do, so let's start with
So,
that.
okay, that sounds workable, that we have a solution, that Ms. Howley is gonna send out a Saturday? And how quickly can we get to that? Do we have any?
She's scheduled to be the next.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And then it's all based on also our time available to review these, because it's gonna take
Thank you. I was just,
time.
I want to make sure you
So
build
we
in time
have
for
to,
yourself to actually look at this.
you know, I might be available this Saturday, but I don't think I can read all these policies by Saturday.
Well, that's what I was
and
gonna say. I
make
want you to be fair to yourself.
Yeah.
So in your dedication to the work, I want to make sure that you build in time to actually have time to review the policies and read them and have time for you all to provide your thoughts, your notes, just to yourself at that point is in the OneNote. So, I mean, in the document. So I would say what we typically do, because keep in mind that while you're doing this, you also have regular meeting information that you're consuming, other work session information that you're consuming.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably say you want at least 2 weeks to have to review. To be fair to you, you may feel like you may need more than that, but I would say that 2 weeks is the minimum that I would say, given that you all also have other board work as directors to do.
So I hear you saying that Ms. Holly, through Dr. Watt's direction, is going to put out a calendar where we're available after a certain point and giving us 2 weeks from now to put those dates out for which Saturdays will be available. Is that correct? Did I hear that?
That's what I.
And everybody obviously understands you need to reply, hopefully, right?
Right.
Or do I need to say that?
She'll come after us.
I will track you down like I've done my college kids when they did correspondence.
So we have a schedule. We have kind of a tentative process of when. We have a format of how we will share and receive these, how the board will receive these and provide their feedback. One piece that is missing that we haven't talked about. So it's great that we have a plan, and I am excited about the plan and intend to follow that. In the rare but absolute real instance, when a policy changes outside of our operating protocols, we will need a process or a way, while you all are thinking about things and kind of deciding things, we'll need to figure out a way for how they are entered into this process. An example of that would be last year there were laws that were passed regarding discipline for students. And that required change in district policy and procedure and some trainings and other things that probably can't wait until we get around to the series addressing that.
That'd be good.
So how would you like to see that information? Does that then move to the top of the list of a regularly scheduled quarterly meeting? Okay. I see heads nodding that kind of seems to be the way
I
to
think
go.
all essentials, we move to the top.
Yeah.
Okay.
And something like that, I think that becomes super essential.
And we can talk about the whys this moves, and if something
Yeah,
comes up, I mean,
yeah.
you would not just hear about it at the quarterly meeting. You'd get some awareness of that prior to that meeting and the
Right.
what, but just wanted to think about that because inevitably every year something changes mid-year that requires some policy update or adjustment. So.
Yeah, that might be a work session, or it might just be off the cycle.
Right. And it depends on how close the next quarterly meeting is scheduled, whether or not, as a board, you wait until that one comes, or?
Mm-hmm.
And do I hear, Jill, that you're the person that picks up on that and lets everybody else know? We're not supposed to be aware of this.
You may have some awareness, but it is like, you are not the person responsible for that. And so I would say we all share in that. I am probably the point person for that, but we all have an awareness. In our areas of interest and work responsibility, we stay on top of, we each receive the WASDA updates monthly of what's changed. We all hear, local news or otherwise, legislative priorities that have shifted sometimes that cause policy to change or necessitate policy change. So you may hear, but you are not responsible as a board to inform us that this law has changed and we need to move
Well,
this.
I'm my responsibilities here, so I can be accountable.
And like I said, you may know, but it's not on you to remind us of that. Did I miss any?
Questions?
Thank you as always. It's,
I have a question. How do we set what we do here? How do I know what's gonna take place?
Like an agenda? You want to,
I had no idea what was gonna take place. It's just the policies and procedures. It doesn't really tell me. And then who sets the work session agenda?
Usually, I'll just speak how we've done it in the past, is that we've always had the calendar laid out ahead of time, and not always it happens necessarily. Sometimes it, subject matter comes up at the last minute, but the agenda should list out specifics, and I work with Karen to make sure that when you come in, we know what is going to be discussed in the agenda, some specifics. Sometimes we add other things to it, but it doesn't happen unless we give 24-hour notice. So typically, we should, as board president, you would speak with Karen, except she's not here this week. And so that's a little bit difficult. But we would discuss and make sure the agenda items cover the specifics. So we know to be prepared, all board members know to be prepared for that night. Whether it's going over, because I thought today we were going over the 1000 series. That's why I called and asked whether we would be discussing today. Because at the last board meeting, which I was told the president had to run it then, we discussed as a group having a discussion on the 1000 series tonight. So we should confirm that with Karen before it goes in. We're discussing.
Yeah, what you just described is so important, one, because the calendar involve all our work. It does have a historical component to it, so it's not always just, we're doing this because we've done this before, but there is a rhyme and reason based on here is the actual topic of discussion. Now that we have a new board, this is the time for me to Karen. It's very soon, I can request it for the page. One of the topics of discussion was that.
That was a discussion we had said that Karen would try to finish it, and I offered to help. Somehow we can push that through, because I think that is what's missing in all of this, is we don't really know what's coming up.
right.
So I need direction. If there's another work session, how before the work session, how advanced do I need to sit down? Karen or whoever's gonna do that, in the administrative secretary position. When do I do that?
I usually just call over the phone. I don't even meet with Karen, because some of these things are laid out. It was last year on the calendar, and I think that's why we're struggling, is that we don't have that calendar in front of us.
Okay, so the calendar generates,
So it gives the time and what's happening. Denise and I worked together before this school year to come up with kind of a sample of what that should look like, but then it just kind of got stalled because there are new board members coming in and you may want to see other things prioritized. So maybe a start would be to show what we did, Denise and I worked together on the calendar, and then you all can have input to that and kind of go from there.
So when can I expect to see something like that?
That's already available. I know that Karen has that already.
They still need to be some revisions.
Yeah, I don't want to leave here not know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm in a vacuum. I just don't like to walk into anything I'm totally unprepared for. I feel like I'm an idiot.
So is today's meeting on a calendar? Like, or what are you saying, that we didn't have a calendar? We don't have a calendar?
Well, we have a calendar that Denise and I drafted, but then the staff wanted to have several meetings, so that was going to get inserted into it, and then Karen has not had time to update that calendar. So a start would be to maybe take a look at what we drafted, and then you all can have input to Karen on what you'd like to see or shift or whatnot. I think that's the struggle we're having right now, is that not having a calendar, we can't plan ahead.
Right.
And so it's not something we wanted to push because the three of you had to have input into it, so it just kind of got stalled.
All right, so this is our agenda tonight, 6:44, 6:45. We're adjourned. Yeah, it's gonna snow in February, Michelle. I got news for you. If not in January. Three. I just feel. I know, but I feel, right. I kind of have that. I mean, there is no, you have to understand, there is no permanent